So okay, we have gone over how to create a user in Mysql from phpMyAdmin. Now it's time to take a look at the code that runs it all, at least in a simple manner. This code is not web ready by any stretch of the imagination, but at least it's a hopping off point where you can see how it all works. Let's first of all take a look at the config.php file. Right here you'll see $con equals new MySQLi localhost, entry php01, entry php01, and then entry php. What we're doing here is a little bit of object-oriented programming. What we're doing is creating an instance of MySQLi, a class within PHP, and creating an object called $con, which allows us to access all the elements of MySQLi. Localhost refers to the computer you're working on, basically. This is where your database would be hosted normally, and it's not always going to be localhost. If you're hosting somewhere, you should be able to find with your host what should be in here. This first entry php01 is a username. The second entry php01 is a password. As you can see, this is not exactly secure, and I would change this if I were working on the real web. And then the name of our database is entry php. So let's go and take a look at our first little bit of code here. This is what is going to fill our database with information. If you look here, we have our require _ once and then config.php, so we're including or linking in our configuration file so that its settings will be available to the rest of the program. This is some elemental error checking. What this does is checks to make sure that we can actually connect to the database server to get our database information. And what it is, again, is a little bit of object-oriented programming. We're accessing the method within our object $con to find out if we can actually connect. And if there is an error, then it simply exits the program, leaving an error message. Now, both of our scripts have next to no error detection. For example, they won't detect or at least properly show if there's no information in your database. If you have a blank database, it's simply going to spit out nothing. If it doesn't connect properly, it's going to probably spit up some kind of a cryptic error message. Anyway, it would be, again, it's not production, so it would be up to you to come up with proper error codes to be less cryptic and log them to a log file. So here we are once again creating an object, so we're accessing the prepare method of our object $con, and what we are doing is prepping what's called an SQL statement so that we can put data into our database. So you'll see insert into my table. There you would, if you did not call this my table when you created your database, then you would want to make sure that you named this according to what you had named it when you created your database. And hopefully you left the rest of the data the same, because what we're going to do is we're going to insert a number into ID, a first name, a last name, and then a start date, which is going to be that 10-digit Unix epoch that we've talked about off and on, the number of seconds since January 1st, 1970. So we're going to insert into these the values here, but what we have is question marks. This is a prepared statement, as I was talking about on Thursday. This has to do with making your database just a little bit more secure. Now, it's not every part of it. If you just do this, it's not enough. You have to do more, but this is good for starts. So we are going to then install into our database strings. That's what S refers to. So we're going to install 4 strings containing ID, first name, last name, and date into our database. So what we're doing here when you see bind param is that we are going to take these data bits that we have here later and put them up here, and then just copy them into the database basically, or insert them into the database. So down here we see put something in our new database, and we're simply assigning values to these variables: the variable $ID, the variable $first name, the variable $last name, and then the variable $date, which we're using time, the Unix function, or the PHP function time, to grab the Unix epoch and assign it to $date. And then here, right under these assignments, we actually do the insert. We've prepared the insert up here. We've made sure that these variables, which are listed up here, have this value in it, and then we actually do the insert here. That's what the execute function does. Now what I've done here with this for loop is I've simply doing a timed loop. All it's doing is running from 0 to 200, so that every time we grab the Unix timestamp, it's going to be different from each one. That's so that each entry has a different timestamp to it. This is not a necessity. I'm simply doing this to show that we can put different timestamps in there. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces of data, 6 pieces of data that we are going to put into our database, and they will each have separate Unix timestamp in the start date field. That's what date does. It puts it into start date, you'll see there. And you'll notice that we're reusing the same variables over and over again. Once we have done the insert, that's okay. We no longer need this particular chunk of data, so we can reassign it. The next piece we'll put 2 in there, then in ID, and so on. So we're not going to cause any issues by doing so. And then down here we simply echo out that new records were created, but again you'll notice that there is no error checking going on, so these could all conceivably execute, and they will put out some kind of an error message, and it could get down here and echo new records created when no records were created. Down here we have prepared, closed, and conclosed. This is just good programming practice. We've opened up a connection to our database server here in the config, and we've also opened up another connection to it basically when we bind the parameters and we insert. So it's only good practice to close them here. So you should be you have these available. You should have them available from the SourceForge site. Let's run this and see what happens, if it's going to work or if I'm going to be choking here. And it says new records created. Let's have a quick look and see if they actually did. And if we actually enter it, yes, you can see they did. Although they do have the same start date, it's just that the program executed so fast it put the same date in there. So this worked as it should have. Now let's take a look at a script which will retrieve the data from the database for us. Again, we are creating a connection here in our config file. It's exactly the same. You can reuse this without any issue. Creating an object, an instance of the class MySQLi, feeding it all the connection parameters we need, and creating an object called $con. We require it up here, and then here's our elemental error checking to see if the connection succeeds or fails. It's a little bit different from the other one. You might want to have a look at that and see why. And then now we are having to retrieve data from the database. So we query MySQLi underscore query and our connection, and then select star from my table, which will just retrieve all of the data from our table. And it loads it into a variable called results. And here, you've seen this before, we're simply printing out the top of a table. Now we have a loop here, a while loop, which assigns values to rows, and then we fetch association, which basically means that we're going to fetch the data out of results and put it in rows, and then print it down here. Now you'll see where we've got $rows, a square bracket, and then in single quotes ID, and then we have a similar thing down here for $rows first name. This is basically a simple way to retrieve data from the database. And there you have a very simple set of code routines to insert and query data from a MySQL database. There is, of course, much more that you can do with it. A lot of the web is driven by SQL databases, and there's a good number of MySQL ones out there. So explore and experiment and see what you can do with it. It might be an idea to see if you can come up with a form to insert this data so that you don't have to be editing a script every time. You can just launch a web page, insert the data, and move on from it.